When I was around 10 years old, there was a day when at school, I always came home for lunch, and some of you remember what that's like when we had that kind of time. And my friend Ralph, his parents and my parents were friends, and after we were about to head home for lunch, Ralph talked me into going to his house for lunch, and I'm like, but I didn't ask permission. Or he's like, we'll call them when we get there, it'll be fine, and my parents will make it all right, and they'll talk your parents into it. And I fell for it, and I went with Ralph, and we started walking back to his house. It's a little further than my house, and we were a little unmotivated to get there quickly. You know how they say time flies when you're having fun? Well, we had a lot of fun. Like, it was so much fun that the lunch hour kind of came and went, and lunch hour was over, and we still weren't at Ralph's house, but we didn't know. It just seemed like we were just moving along, right? And so by the time we got to Ralph's house, the school had already called home, and our parents were alerted. And unbeknownst to us, we were in a lot of trouble. And so we walked into Ralph's house, and it was kind of like we were facing the parents, and they were freaking out, and the questioning began, right? Like the grilling about what happened and where were we. And I remember Ralph's mom saying, where were you? What were you thinking? And Ralph, how did you think time was passing? Why did it take you so long to get home? Didn't you know how time was passing? How did you think time was passing? To which Ralph answered, tick, tock, tick, tock. I have to tell you that Ralph was adopted. So his parents couldn't have children of their own. My parents could bury me in the backyard and have a replacement in 9 months. So I did not say stuff like tick-tock to my parents. I just stood there going, what is going to happen next? Is Ralph going to disappear from existence? But he did not. They just kind of chuckled at him. I was like, I'm still going to be in trouble, and I didn't even say tick-tock. And of course, now that I'm a parent, I understand what that's like. I know that feeling, and for most parents, you've maybe had that moment when you're at the mall with your kids, and all of a sudden you were like, they were right there, and then they're gone. Is it just me? Only my kids that disappear? And I remember like getting a little bit louder and calling their name, and then getting louder and louder and louder till I'm screaming at the top of my lungs until I see like a rack of pants kind of shaking. And I open them up, and one of my kids is in there, like especially my son, and he'd be laughing. Like, that's funny? And I'm thinking some creep has taken my son and tucked him under his arm and taken off, and here he is laughing and thinking, this is hilarious. And so, it's not that funny. And which brings us to our story, right? Jesus is traveling to Jerusalem with his parents. His parents went every year, and now Jesus is 12, and they're headed there. And because the whole village kind of goes for Passover to Jerusalem, like most of Nazareth kind of cleared out, and the people who were headed to the capital city to go to the temple and to worship God, they all traveled in one big caravan. And so Jesus' parents apparently let him have some latitude. Like you go hang out with your friends, but they probably, any good mom goes down the rules, right? Like, don't get separated from the pack, and make sure you check in and all those things. And so Jesus is kind of allowed to go and hang out with his cousins, with his friends, with his family members, and with other people in the group. And so they get to Jerusalem, and they worship together, and they do the stuff that they're there for, and then the whole caravan is ready to head home, and they head off, and unbeknownst to Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph are in the caravan. They assume Jesus is in the caravan, and that he's traveling with them. He's just with his cousins or his friends somewhere, and they get rolling, and they get moving and moving and moving outside of where they're going. And Nazareth to Jerusalem is about 4 days travel, 90 miles, right? And they're traveling mostly on foot. And so they're headed out, and they're like a good piece on the way back to Nazareth when they think, well, we should go check on Jesus and see where he is. So they go see with the cousins, and he's not with the cousins. So then they go, well, who's Jesus' best friend? Let's go check Jesus' best friend. Jesus' best friend is all on his own. He goes, no. And so they start checking around with other friends. And who else is Jesus hanging out with these days? And who else might know where he is? And then they're going to people that they're like, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't go there, but he's not with the others, so we got to find out, where is Jesus? And they're like, when have you seen Jesus last? Has anybody seen Jesus? Did you see him yesterday? Do you know where he was? Who has he been with? Who did you see? Where did you see him? When was that? Can you remember? And they can't find Jesus anywhere in the whole group. Now they've been around the entire caravan, and they've asked everyone they can ask, and Jesus is still missing. And so now they're like, well, I guess we're heading back to Jerusalem. Like, maybe he got lost on the way. Maybe something happened. Maybe he went to go to the bathroom and the caravan kept moving and he took a little longer than usual and they were out of sight by the time he came back out. Like, that could have happened, I guess. Or he could he be still in Jerusalem? Is it possible? So they head back and they retrace their steps and they're watching and waiting and they're probably calling out, Jesus, right? And they're looking for him. And they get all the way back to Jerusalem and they're like, this is scary. Like, we don't know where he is. We don't know what happened. We don't know if he's safe. And so they're panicking at this point. And when they retrace their steps all the way back to Jerusalem, they finally go back to the temple because that's where we guess we saw him last. And then his parents find him in the temple talking to these old guys and scholars and the religious leaders, and they're kind of swapping answers and questions, and he's talking to them like he knows what he's talking about. And so we're told that all the other people are amazed at his understanding and his answers. It's almost like, how does this 12-year-old know so much about God? How could any boy just know about God like that? And they can't figure it out. And Jesus' parents, they have a different response. To 12-year-old Jesus, this is no big deal. Now that makes sense. Those of us who have had teenage kids, we know some of those situations that they don't think are a big deal, but his parents thought this was a really big deal because they can't find him. They don't know where he is. They haven't known where he's safe. And when they find him there talking to the other people are amazed. They have a little bit of a different reaction going through their heads. So why am I telling you this story? Why did I keep, it's Christmas, right? Like, we're moving towards, we lit the Advent candles. We're moving towards the birth of Jesus. And in Luke's gospel, he unpacks those stories. We talked about 3 of those stories as he unfolds the events of them going to Bethlehem and his birth there and all those kind of things. And then we had baby Jesus in the temple, being dedicated and for the purification ceremony and the dedication, the presenting him to the Lord, and Simeon and Anna, talking to him and saying such wonderful things about him. And those kind of stories maybe make sense at Christmas, but how does the story of Jesus the troubled teen fit in with Christmas? Like, did I push it one step too far? Am I too obsessed? It is my type A personality to, just follow along, right? And complete the story. And this is the next story that Luke tells. But why talk about that? Isn't Christmas supposed to be about the baby? Now we're talking about the teenager that's causing trouble. And it's clear that his parents didn't feel honored or respected. In fact, what we're told is that his parents didn't know what to think. Son, his mother said to him, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been frantic searching for you everywhere. To be honest, if it wasn't Jesus, every parent here goes, man, she's got a point, right? Like, because it doesn't make sense. And so they're frantic. Of course they're frantic. They're scared. They care about their kid's safety. That makes sense. That's normal. And then there's his response to Mary. He says, but why did you need to search? Didn't you know that I must be around my Father's house? Like, forget it's Jesus for a minute. That's a pretty nonchalant kind of answer. It's kind of lippy. In my mind, that's a little too close to tick-tock, tick-tock, right? And if it wasn't Jesus, we'd all feel like he is going to get it and he deserves it, and how dare you do that to your mom? He basically says, you didn't need to be looking for me. You should have known where I was. And then Luke throws in this line. He says, but they didn't understand what he meant. He gives his answer, and we're told they didn't get it. They didn't understand what he was drilling at. So what was it they were supposed to understand? Like what was he trying to say? How do we understand Jesus to be making sense at that moment? Is it more than just he's flippantly saying, no big deal. You should have known. Like, we were all in Jerusalem, right? And why am I telling this story at Christmas anyway? Jesus isn't a baby anymore when this happened, and Christmas is supposed to be about the baby, not about, some teenager story that's a little awkward and a little messy and a little out there. Well, first of all, it does come next in the story. And then there's also the fact that it reminds us that babies all grow up. And some of us have watched our kids get older and older, and you say, stop growing, like I like you the way you are now, and I'm afraid. And everybody who has a teenager has those moments when they're like, wasn't it easy when they were a baby? I thought it was tough, but not like this. And so why is Jesus saying this to his mom? Why does he seem to be so flippant? What is he drilling down to? And for that, I think you got to understand that when Luke tells the story, Luke is the only gospel writer that includes this part of the story. He's the only one that tells us about teenage Jesus. He's the only one that throws that story in. And it isn't because he goes, well, I also know this one story, I'll put it in between, and before I get to his adult life and after he was a baby, I'll just mention this one story that I happen to know. He's put it there for a specific reason. And if you follow along with the way he's unfolding who Jesus is and the significance of his birth, as he tells us about the angels, and as he has Jesus being presented in the temple, and Simeon and Anna both going, this is incredible, like the Messiah's here. The power structure of the world is all upended, and this baby looks like a baby. He looks helpless and vulnerable, but he's going to change everything. He's the one that's going to save us and rescue us. And so as Luke unfolds it, when he gets to this part of the story, he tells us this story because when Jesus responds, if we remember what just happened in the last episode, you remember they came in and they had this big message from Simeon and Anna, but they were there to present baby Jesus to the Lord. That's one of the things they were there for. Purification ceremony for Mary, but also this presenting him to the Lord, what we do when we dedicate a baby. And so when Jesus says, but why did you need to search? Didn't you know I must be in my Father's house? He's reminding them of that ceremony. He's reminding them of the vows they made when they said, hey, God, this is your baby, and you've entrusted him or her to me, and here's my response to that. It has implications in the real world for Jesus, and he's reminding his parents that meant something. And when I look back at my life, there was a ceremony when I was a teenager, and I don't think I understood what it meant, but I stood up front of the church, and they made us members of the church. And so we made certain promises that we would live a certain way and that we understood what membership meant. I didn't fully understand, but I said it. I remember the pastor's kid was supposed to be standing there with us, and he didn't do it. He backed out. And there was all kinds of, I wonder what that was about. So there was that ceremony, and then there was the ceremony where I stood in the front of a church with Roxanne, and we held hands, and a pastor asked us those questions, and we said, I do, and I said that I would love, honor, and cherish her. And she said the same to me, and we meant it. And we look back on that moment, and it's more than just the nice pictures where I had a mullet. And anytime I told that story, it was funny before, and now the kids are growing mullets again. I'm not doing that a second time. I've learned my lesson. Just saying, kids. You will be sorry later if there's photographic evidence. But we stood there and we made our promises and we meant them. And we reflect back on those promises and say, yeah, that was serious. That meant something. That was something that we took seriously. And that didn't just last for a day, but it was something that we took to heart. And there was a ceremony that I stood up front in front of a couple of thousand people. And I knelt down and a bunch of other pastors laid their hands on my head and they prayed for me. And I was ordained as a minister to preach the gospel. And I felt the weight, not of their hands, but of the burden of trying to not mess up talking about God in ways that people would understand Him and that might impact their lives positively. I felt like I'm saying something here that matters, and I hope I can live up to what I'm saying. And sometimes when ministry gets tough, I look back at that and go, I made a promise. That may not mean something to some people, but it did to me. Marriage is not just a piece of paper, and membership is not just a formality. And that sacred moment that they made me a pastor means something to me. And then there's dedicating our children, right? And when our babies came along, they were in the first service. And so I couldn't tell stories about them as much, but we'll see how much time we got. But I remember holding them up, right? I held them in my arms, and we made promises about how we would raise them. I remember the moments in the hospital after they were born. I remember, especially Jonah, I remember being in the hallway of the hospital because the nurses trusted me and they just walked away and I was supposed to take them in. And I stood in the hallway in a dark hospital in Stratford, Ontario, and it was the middle of the night, and I made promises to that boy. Like I looked at him and I felt the weight with my firstborn because she was my firstborn. I felt the weight with Jonah because I'm like, I'm his example of what a man is, and I don't know if I can do this. I felt like I had to do it right, and I wanted to honor. And when I took the promises in the sanctuary, it was kind of that same kind of sacred moment where I said to God, like, this baby is yours, and you trusted me to raise him, and I don't want to mess up. Please help me. I don't know about you, but as a parent all through the years, there are moments when I felt helpless. There are moments when I was sitting in a waiting room at the hospital for the test results, or while they had an MRI, or where something else was happening. I've talked to them in conversations when they were hurting and they didn't know what decisions to make, and I felt like they were in pain, and I just wanted to take it away, and I just wanted to tell them that everything would be all right, and I wanted to make it better, and I couldn't change anything, and I felt useless, and I felt helpless, and I was like relying back on that moment when I said they're God's, and it's like He's reminding me they don't belong to you. And I'm like, God, you got to help me. They're yours, and you love them even more than I do. I have to trust you with them. I said it back then, and I better mean it now. If this is going to be okay for them. And I put them back into His hands again. And I said, God, look after them, please. I mean, I know she's yours more than she's mine, but this is my little girl. And if I'm going to say something, if I'm going to make this better, I got to get it right, and you got to help me because I need you. And I thought about that moment, holding them up and telling God those promises. And we live in a world where people back out of promises all the time. But it meant something. And Jesus is saying to his parents, look, did you mean that? When you said I belong to God the Father and not to you, did you mean that or not? Was that just the thing you do with babies? That's just expected? Did grandma say she would like to see that happen and you just following through with the motions? Or do you mean that they belong to me and that you trust me with them? So Jesus is going, I got to be in my Father's house. Did you trust me with him or not? Do you get that this isn't just the thing you say, but you need to put your money where your mouth is right now and trust me into the hands of a God that has more control over the universe than you do? Is he real? Does he care? Do you believe it or not? In that moment, you're like, I don't want to let go. I don't want to pry my fingers off and let go of the control and the ability to do it myself. But I made a promise. And it wasn't just an empty ceremony. It wasn't just a church ritual. There's something about those things that we do in here that they either matter or we're just playing around. And so Luke tells us this story to point back to that story and say, that was just not routine. That Jesus understood the weight of it. And Jesus, once again, is not just pointing Mary and Joseph back, but he points us back to be the kind of people who make vows before God, who trust God with our lives, trust God with our children, and that's harder. And they had said it and they had meant it, but now he reminds them so that they lock in those moments when they are most afraid and feel most helpless and aren't sure what's going to happen next. Didn't you know this is exactly where I would be because I have always been in the hands of the Father, just like all of us. And you don't like that I'm not in your hands. You don't like that you're not controlling the situation. You don't like that all of a sudden you're reminded that I'm growing up and I'm vulnerable and you might not always be there to protect me. But I have a heavenly Father who is watching over me. And if you trust him, even those moments when you feel helpless and vulnerable, it'll be okay. And he will do what he promised. And I don't know what promises you've already made, and I don't know which ones you're about to make or that will come up in your life. What kind of vows you've made before God and what things you might be called on to do, but don't do them emptily. That's not a word, but you know what I mean. Don't do them without meaning. Don't do them because other people expect them. Don't say things that you don't mean to God. And the truth is, sometimes we say them and we mean them, and then we find out the depth of how much we mean them when we're really in the thick of it. And we either trust God with our stuff and our people, or we don't. And Jesus reminds us, just like he reminds Mary and Joseph, God is trustworthy. He is our heavenly Father. It isn't just his son he's looking out for. It's my son and my daughter and your children and everyone we love. If we put our trust in him, we will never be let down.